Now, the Ford Foundation is reimagining local philanthropy in Nigeria in spite of the country's tough economic environment. Speaking to me now on this from our Lagos studios is Dr. Chichi Aniagolu Okoye. Good evening to you, madam, and many thanks for joining me on the show today.
Thank you very much. Good evening.
All right, so let's kick off. What are your ideas around sustainable philanthropy at the local level in an environment such as Nigeria?
I think it is actually the missing link. We recognize that the economy isn't doing very well and that the government and the private sector have always been the ones that have been called upon to try and improve the economy. But the reality is that without an active civil society, without local philanthropists taking the risks that government or the private sector are unwilling to take, that the development we want to see may not be feasible in a very long time. And I can give you an example. We are giving people, because we don't have a social security program in this country, many people have to support the less privileged in their family. But the reality is that that type of giving, while it's extremely important, is not sustainable. And it's also not something that is going to make the difference that we want to see. So what we're trying to, what we're advocating for the Ford Foundation is that people who give at the grassroots level should be thinking about it in a sustainable manner. So imagine that you are you live in the diaspora and you send money home, but the village your parents live in has no healthcare system. Your relatives are going to schools that are completely dilapidated. To what extent is that going to make any difference? If your parents fall ill, they are not going to survive it because there is no way that they're going to be able to get the kind of treatment they need in that local village where they're living. So in thinking about this, people also have to think, how can we support the local community to be able to provide the services that they want to see and that are necessary for the existence of people? We also know that, for example, that local businesses are really struggling with government policies, and a lot of those local businesses many times, are not able to get around policies because the policies that are being done by government does not always consult them. But if you look at many of the policies that have been developed in the social sector, if you look at HIV, education, agriculture, water and sanitation, you name them, many of them were done with the support of civil society, with funding from development partners. And so we're saying that businesses can also benefit from this if they will support local NGOs, civil society organizations that are very good at working with government to develop policies. They will be in a position to develop the kind of policies that they want to see with government, so that it's not a situation where they are constantly reactionary. A policy has come out and then they start reacting to it. But if they're proactive and they support civil society, they can actually work with government to develop the kind of policies that they need, multiple taxation and other challenges that the private sector faces. They are not going to be able to do it because they don't have the capacity to develop these kind of policies with government. And government itself needs help to be able to design those policies. And that's where working with civil society organizations come in. And that's what international development partners have done for decades, working with civil society organizations to help improve the social sector in Nigeria. And I think that local businesses, local philanthropies can do the same by supporting local civil society organizations to improve the business environment.
All right, so we see the growth of philanthropy in developed economies. Just curious, what's responsible for that and how can we learn from this?
Well, the thing is that, government alone cannot do the development we want to see. I mean, England, just like you said, the philanthropy sector brings in 11 billion pounds every year, and the UK is a developed country. The reality is that there are many things that neither the government nor the private sector going to be able to do. There are many innovations that are expensive, that are risky, that the private sector is not going to fund, and government may not necessarily be interested in that. So I'll just give you an example in our climb. Many times we talk about agriculture, having huge potentials. But have you ever wondered why it just never takes off, even though we have 200 million people who need food? Isn't that a viable place for people to come in and invest in agriculture? The reason it doesn't happen is because the agricultural sector is extremely underdeveloped. And the private sector is not going to take the risks that are required to be able to develop the sector. So let me give you an example. We do a lot of peasant farming in Nigeria. So if you are somebody who wants to come and set up a Gary processing or a cassava processing company, for example, in Nigeria, you're going to have to aggregate the peasant farmers. You're going to have to set up a whole aggregation system. It might take you a year or two. And this is before you can even produce any cassava. Are you going to do it as a private sector person? But what is required is for civil society to be able to do that. And a lot of NGOs that work in the agriculture sector are doing that, aggregating farmers, training farmers, building the capacity of farmers. And so they are the ones who will have to get the industry to the level where the private sector will now be interested in it. And that's why it's not happening. And that's what we need to learn from other climes, that many of them, both the government and the private sector, invested through philanthropy to be able to build these sectors that require, intervention before they become attractive to the private sector. So that's why people still do it. And in developed countries, there's still many areas that are requiring, research, that are requiring interventions that are not profitable. And the private sector and the philanthropy sector is filling that gap.
All right. So is there a role that the federal government needs to play to enhance a local philanthropy?
Indeed. In many countries, people don't just give because they are good people. They give because there are incentives for giving. There are tax breaks for giving. The Conservative government in England has a white paper on giving. So there's actually a whole, a whole policy around giving. The government needs to understand that it cannot do this itself. And so it needs to be able to provide incentives for giving, so that individuals and companies can give. Right now, there are some incentives for giving, but many individuals, there are no incentives for individuals to give. So it doesn't matter, how much you give. It doesn't come out of your tax. There's nothing you get from giving, and yet many people are supporting family members and the rest of it. So that needs to be incentivized. There needs to be incentives for small companies and other people who want to give. But more importantly, the government also has to recognize, just like it has recognized that it is not good at doing business, that it is not good at providing social services either. And so it needs to be looking at a government, civil society, private sector partnership, not just a civil society, not just the private sector government partnership. You need civil society in that mix, because many of the services that government is providing are failing because government is not good at providing services. If you look at the United States, for instance, there are many services that the government offers, but are actually being run by local civil society organizations or charities, as they call them there. So that's what the government needs to do. Hospitals, education, all the important social sectors, they should hand them over to civil society organizations that have been able to do that effectively for so many years in this country. And that will make a dramatic difference, I think, in the way those services are provided.
Indeed, and I really believe that when you give, it gives you this sense of satisfaction that you've done something good to someone. Thank you so much, Madam, for speaking with us. We really appreciate your time on the show today. Thank you.